We good? Okay. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the latest lecture in our 2020 virtual Chautauqua lecture series. My name is Dakota Harkins, and I'm the Director of Education and Heritage Programming here at Lakeside Chautauqua. Today, we're going to be continuing our series and our week one theme on women in sports with Jeremy Swick, who's joining us live from the College Football Hall of Fame in Atlanta. I want to say a few words about our upcoming season before we get to that. First and foremost, thank you everyone for joining us on Zoom. I know there have been some issues this week with connecting, but hopefully we'll work through those as we get through the season. Because of all of the things that have happened over the course of the last few months, we will be hosting all of our Chautauqua Lecture Series programs virtually on Zoom for the rest of the season, I'm sorry. If you have any issues throughout the season connecting, or if you have any questions about the schedule, please feel free to contact the Education Department directly and we will get you connected. That being said, we do have links that are going to be provided for each of the programs each day on Lakeside Chautauqua's calendar. If you go to the calendar first, you will find that all of the education series links are on the calendar, and you will be taken to another page that has all of the programs for the week with the buttons to click watch on Zoom. Throughout all of our Zoom programs, we're going to be utilizing the Q&A function, the bump out that will ask you to put your questions in a separate question and answer forum. We're doing this because we, much like whenever we are on site, we're going to be holding all of our questions until the end of the program. For those of you who may not have realized, our speakers cannot see you, unfortunately, when we're using Zoom this way. So if you have questions, we have to use the Q&A forum, and I will be moderating those questions throughout the program to ask whenever we get to the end. And with all of that out of the way, I'm very excited to introduce our speaker today, Mr. Jeremy Swick, who is joining us, as I said, from the Chick-Fil-A College Football Hall of Fame in Atlanta. He is the curator and historian at the College Football Hall of Fame, and he earned his master's in public history from Eau Claire University in Wisconsin. And he's held a number of positions in historic sites and museums around the country, including at the Pro Football Hall of Fame in 2016, where we happened to meet. It's hard to believe that it's been that long since we were there, but thank you for joining us today, Jeremy. We're so glad to have you. I wish you could be with us here on site in Lakeside, but I know you've had a busy couple of weeks with all the changes that are happening down there and all of the current events that are affecting the museum. So we're glad that you're able to take the time with us today.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dakota. Thank you for having us. I'm excited. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here. I'm just going to get my PowerPoint set up real quick. So I wanted to welcome you to a Hidden History, Women in College Football. Hello, everyone. My name is Jeremy Swick. As Dakota wonderfully mentioned, I am the historian and curator at the Chick-Fil-A College Football Hall of Fame. And here's just a brief introduction to who I am. So as I already mentioned, I am the historian and curator for the Hall of Fame. I'm originally from Wisconsin, and I love history. One of my favorite parts about history is connecting the past and present to a variety of learners of all ages, from those in kindergarten to those continuing learning on all throughout life. I love when people have that aha moment with history. Well, how do I know what I know? As Dakota mentioned, I studied Broadfield Social Studies education with an emphasis in history as an undergraduate. And this really developed a love and passion for high school students, which has always been a passion of mine. After I left the traditional classroom, I wanted to find a way to connect with the public and history. That's when I completed my master's in public history in 2017. My main areas of focus in school were African American history, especially as it relates to the civil rights movement. This included the more traditional civil rights movement, but also a more broader stroke with also U.S. foreign and domestic policy during that time frame. I also studied the history of media and popular culture, especially as it relates to sport. Within that area, my primary focus of sport was around early American football and early American rugby. Being a museum professional, I often behind the scenes of helping an organization develop and grow. Often I am not on the front lines, if you will, although I do miss it a lot. This is an area I would love to get back to one day, but opportunities such as this are an excellent outlet to share my knowledge and help foster the same love of history that I have. So I wanted to begin real quickly with just a brief overview of just the history of football and how it's grown today before I talk about women in college sports as well. So first we have to start the history of rugby. For thousands of years, different variations of what is known in the United States as soccer has been played all over the world. Although the exact years of these games first beginning is lost to history. The game known rugby has a more concrete origin. In 1823, at the now famous rugby school in the town of Rugby in Warwickshire, England, the sport was born. Similar to schools across England, soccer, as it was called, association football then, was played using the foot, and running with the ball in your hand was prohibited. Now this story might be a little bit of a tall tale, but it definitely gives us a general idea of what most accept the founding of rugby. At the rugby school, all games were required to end at the stroke of 5. A student by the name William Webb Ellis received the ball, which had been kicked by the opposing team. Instead of kicking the ball for a free kick, as was tradition, Ellis tucked the ball under his arm and ran the score to beat the last ring of the bell. The other players on the field were so astonished and confused at this regard for the traditional rules. Eventually, his peers realized that Ellis had developed something revolutionary and contrary to the established order of how most ball games were typically played during this period of time. Thus, the game of rugby was born. Although this might be a little bit more of a legend than concrete fact, there's still a plaque that remains to this day at rugby school that honors William Webb Ellis, and the founder of rugby. And the interesting aspect of that is for the Rugby World Cup, they've named the trophy the William Webb Ellis Trophy in honor of his lore. In January of 1871, rugby players formed their own governing body known as the Rugby Football Union, thus creating a body of government developed from a schoolyard game, which would eventually become an internationally known sport. However, rugby was still in its infancy, as it was yet to face its own set of trials and tribulations. As rugby grew in popularity and tradition, it migrated with the British colonists to the seaside provinces of Canada and began to expand west. So of course, rugby comes to the United States. First, we're going to talk about 1827. In 1827 at Harvard, the sophomore-freshman game, which was nothing more than a rush between the classes, had developed into a well-established tradition. The first Monday of the fall semester, when the classes met, they usually clashed, which was known as Bloody Monday. Bloody Monday was a battle between the freshman and sophomore classes, although all 4 classes participated, the seniors siding with the sophomores and the juniors siding with the freshmen. It was a contest to see who could reign supreme. The opposing sides met on what was known as the Delta, now Memorial Hall, in a pseudo scrimmage where the opposing teams would stop at nothing in order to tackle the opposing side using any means necessary. John L. Sibley, the longtime librarian at Harvard, described Bloody Monday as the ball is thrown down among the players, and the object of each class is to kick the other and bark their shins as much as possible. Many of the students took great enjoyment in competing in the violent confrontation. One student wrote a poem of the events of the melee that annually occurred on the Delta. All the shins we cracked, and noses we whacked, and the eyeballs we blackened, and all in fun. Well, eventually this game went on too long. So eventually the university staff abolished the game in 1860, citing the excessive amounts of violence and brutality especially on the first couple days of classes. Well, around the same time, as the saying goes, history usually doesn't happen in a vacuum. The same thing develops in different areas throughout the course of history. So the Boston game. The same year as a boy by the name Garrett Smith, known as Gat Miller, attended Sergeant Dixwell's private Latin school and began playing a game with 16 on a side, distinctive enough from the traditional game of soccer to give it the name the Boston game. One of the most distinct rules of the Boston game was that a player could run with the ball as long as they were being pursued by an opponent. As this game was created in the secondary level of schooling, it was only a matter of time before it leaked to the college campus. On April 12th, 1872, the freshmen and sophomores met in an organized game using the Boston game rules, different than the Bloody Monday games of the past. This gave it a little bit more legitimacy by the universities as well. By December of that year, the Harvard Football Club was created. This was the first intercollegiate game of rugby football on May 14th, 1874. However, the first college football game, which is recognized by most historians, actually occurred in 1869 between Rutgers and Princeton. This game used much more of what we would know as American soccer rules, and it was actually a game to 10. So the final score was 6-4. It was actually 6 games to 4. But this first intercollegiate rugby game on May 14th, 1874, between Harvard and McGill took place. The first match between the two teams was played under the Boston game rules, and Harvard won easily. The second match the two schools played resulted in a tie under McGill's Canadian rugby rules, which uniquely allowed the players to run with the ball regardless if they were being chased by an opponent. This game marked the first game of rugby played in the United States. And as you can see, throughout time, the game's starting to develop a little bit more of rugby, but it's not quite American football as we know it today. Although early rugby football and English rugby were closely related, early American rugby football and English rugby were closely related, they began to drift away from each other. Equipment and rules began to give away to the uniquely American sport. So I want to briefly talk about the early football equipment, and these images were actually taken from the Spalding guys, which we thankfully have collections dating back to the late 1800s in our museum and archives. So the football equipment introduced an innovative protective gear, which included protective jerseys that were sewn out of leather and just added support. Also protective pants with pads inside of them. Of course, the early forms of helmets, if you could even consider that a helmet, and you cannot forget the Morse nose guards that were aimed to protect the nose. Interestingly, you actually would bite down on the nose guard, and that's how it would keep in place, just in case the headband let loose. Now you can see the early football and rugby rules. The early football field, which is tan, and the early rugby field, which is white. Early football evolved from rugby and other games, such as the Boston game. As early as the 1880s, rules began to be organized to allow intercollegiate teams to be able to play each other on an agreed upon set of rules. A majority of the laws and rules were directly taken from rugby rules, making what many considered at the time dangerous. One of the more distinguished differences from rugby and early football was the number of players who were on the field. In rugby, 15 to 20 men played on each side in the game, depending on the time period. Rather, in early football, the number was reduced to 11 men on the field. The size of the field, the early football fields were 330 feet in length by 160 feet in width. 2 goalposts would be erected to each goal line and were 18.5 inches in height. The in-touch line marked where the ball or player with the ball would be marked out of bounds. The dimensions and size of the fields were similar to rugby fields of this time. Throughout both rugby and football's history, the scoring has continually changed over the years, often from one year to the next, and it's too difficult to break down a year-by-year statistic. There was no permanent set positions at the time in either sport, often causing mob-like play, leading to dangerous outcomes. The fact that early rugby and early football were nearly identical meant American teams adopted many of the early rugby rules. They also supplemented rules from games such as the previously mentioned Boston game, and with memories of the Bloody Mondays of the past, created a unique opportunity for violence in the United States. So let me briefly touch on the violence. As you can see, this cartoon was actually taken from a Cincinnati newspaper, and it shows the Grim Reaper actually waiting on the goalpost to see the outcome of the play that's going on. From the beginning of the inclusion of rugby football as part of collegiate life, an important question arose. Was the game too dangerous for young men to play? Reports throughout the country of otherwise healthy young men being killed while playing collegiate rugby football, or dying from their injuries shortly after their arrival to the hospital started to become a widespread national attention. This increase in fatalities caused many schools to call for the banning of college football unless the rules were modified in a way that was safer for players to play the game. The uproar caused many top football schools to suspend their programs. Excuse me. From 1900 to 1905, there were reportedly 45 deaths from football-related injuries. In 1905 alone, 19 of those deaths occurred by October. On October 4th of that year, Garfield Weed, a player from the University of Pennsylvania, was tackled so hard while running, his leg was brutally broken. In another case, Howard C. Montgomery, a player at Hampton-Sydney College, was injured while playing in a practice game as his team prepared to play the Virginia Military Institute. He died at the age of 21 from a broken neck after he was unsuccessfully operated on. Shortly after this, the Hampton-Sydney College decided to make the movement to disband as a team, citing the sad death of young Mr. Montgomery, who was injured on the football field, was the cause of this movement. Reports of death ran rampant throughout the country due to football-related fatalities. In 1905, Columbia's Committee on Student Organization passed resolutions to abolish football at the university, saying that the game is dangerous to human life. This decision came after another death from football from a youth who was killed in Missouri. Interestingly enough, Theodore Roosevelt was football's unlikely savior. He initially survived influenza as a child, and it really, interestingly enough, impacted the game of football, excuse me. President Theodore Roosevelt. As a young child, he was habitually unhealthy, whether it was colds, fevers, coughs. Despite these ailments, Roosevelt loved the outdoors and enjoyed playing and running outside. As a child, he began making daily visits to Wood's Gymnasium, a prominent gym close to his house. His family was a family of means. The owner of the gym, John Wood, had worked with some of New York's most prestigious families, as well as athletes from Columbia University. This lit the fire for Roosevelt's desire to be physically fit well into his adult life. Many know him as the Rough Rider. He picked up the sport of boxing, learning how to work the ring. Once admitted to Harvard, Roosevelt became a nearly instant supporter of Harvard's football team. He recalled his first game as a freshman against Yale. Despite Yale winning the contest, he relished the passion the fans had. During the summer of 1905, Roosevelt had one of his most prominent roles as a negotiator in his presidency. Roosevelt had negotiated and mediated a peace accords between two of the most powerful countries in the world, Japan and Russia. This may seem like an issue notably different from football, but Roosevelt met the football coaches with the same energy and directness which he would have greeted Count Witt or Baron Kumara. Roosevelt took the issue much like he would have any political exercise during this time. He was described in one paper as that sturdy lover of peace has started a series of conferences designed to prevent the mutilation, bloodshed, and murder on the football gridiron. On October 9th, 1905, Roosevelt called a meeting between the football powerhouses, Harvard, Yale, and Princeton, to work towards creating rules that would be more acceptable to the masses. During these proceedings, Roosevelt also had a more personal stake in the football controversy. His son, Theodore Roosevelt Jr., was injured playing on the freshman football team. When, as the news reports, when the pile was disentangled, he was bleeding profusely from the cut above his eyes. As you can see, this image was taken from a newspaper of young Mr. Roosevelt. The stakes are raising to solve the football controversy that was facing the nation. So next, we'll get into the American football rule changes. American football began to take a more recognizable form following the Roosevelt administration's decision to set up the meeting between the top college football experts. The rules were worked to make the game safer for players, aiming to reduce the alarming number of injuries while on the field. The rule changes also morphed American football into what we can now consider a uniquely American sport. Roosevelt was selective in who he had attend these meetings to decide the rule changes. He had a Harvard man, as he wanted discussions between Princeton and Harvard and Yale to be balanced and fair. He invited John Bean Fine and Arthur T. Hildebrand of Princeton. Fine was the dean at Princeton, Hildebrand was their coach. From Harvard, Edwin H. Nichols and William T. Reed. Nichols was the team physician and Reed was their coach. From Yale, Walter Camp and John E. Owsley. Camp was their coach and Owsley was their assistant coach. Clearly, each of the men had genuine interest in saving the game. They were set to have the initial meetings that would revolutionize football. Arguably, the most prominent men he had at these meetings were Walter Camp, known today as the founding father of American football. Walter Camp was a player at Yale from 1887 to 1892, being named to the captain in 1887 to 1882, being named captain in 1887, 89, and 1881. Camp posted a highly respected record as a player with 25 wins, 1 loss, and 6 ties. Ties were much more common during that era. This man, Camp, had been on the front lines of the gridiron and was able to give valuable insight into the state of the game during this time. By the time Camp was coaching Yale, he desperately wanted the game he loved to remain. He set to develop the rules such as the forward pass, which would help make the game safer as it would spread out the field more. It was still a while before these men, among others in collegiate football, would agree to terms on what rules would be considered in 1906. Following another death from football between Union College and New York University, it was apparent to Henry McCracken, the counselor at NYU, that football needed to be abolished or reformed. He reached out to Harvard knowing their assistance and prestige could be helpful. Harvard threatened to ban football as president of the school, Charles Eliot, believed there was no place in higher education for such violence. Eliot refused McCracken's request and created his own committee. Although it did not have the most prestigious names, what it lacked in quality, people made up for in quantity. 68 institutions attended. The two committees were finally able and willing to merge and began setting rules to reform football. The game would have would have a referee, 2 umpires, a linesman, and each would serve a role on the field to ensure that the new and former rules were actually being followed by the players. This created the help to reduce the likelihood of players cheating the rules and not being punished. More eyes on them meant there was less a player could get away with. Another change was the implement of the amount the game would last. It was reduced from 2 40-minute halves to 2 30-minute halves. It would eventually be 4 15-minute quarters. The next set of rules that were issued primarily focused on player safety. The line of scrimmage was developed. Each team's line of scrimmage was an imaginary parallel line that reached to the goal line and passed through the point of the ball's nearest to the team's own goal line. Thus, there were 2 lines of scrimmage, and you could not be, which were separated by the length of the ball. This brought the control of the players, aiming to reduce big collisions and momentum. Players had to start from a stop position. These offensive and defensive lines, which would give name to the early term linesmen, would be able to pursue each other once the ball was snapped. One of the most famous rule changes, however, was the invention of the forward pass. The forward pass was designed to be used once a play originally, and to pass the line of scrimmage and be at least 5 yards. The reason behind this was because it caused the defense to spread out and cover the field, although it wasn't widely used in its initial inception. Players who were attempting to make a fair catch had to raise their hands above their head while they were advancing towards the ball. Both these rules worked to stop the big hit by having players on both offense and defense the same distance from each other to cut down on one side gaining too much momentum or power. Another major set of these rules looked for player safety, and these rules were regarding foul play. It amplified special set rules that against striking with the fist, elbowing, knee, or kicking, which were prominent in the early stages of the game. Additionally, defensive players were forbidden to strike in the face with the heel of their hand of an opponent who was carrying the ball. Again, you remember during this period of time, the use of helmets wasn't the same as it was today. These sets of rules made it clear what players could and could expect if they disobeyed the rules and continued to play football the same way they had done previously. It also looked to keep officials accountable to the following the rules that would be implemented on the gridiron. Although many applauded the new rules and they were willing to change the newly Americanized style, not everyone agreed with the decision. Many were suspicious of these untested new Americanized versions of the rules. This sparked many teams on the West Coast especially to rebel against the eastern part of the country and the Midwest, creating an interesting East-West divide that lasted throughout the early part of the 20th century. And again, this is just a quick little breakdown of the rules I mentioned. I won't go into a complete detail, but just kind of giving a visual representation of what I was discussing. You can see the line of scrimmage there, and just ways to really break up the field and create more space. So now there were also rugby rule changes post-1874. Again, like every kind of sport, it changes throughout time. There was definitely complaints of the violence, and it was not before many wanted to connect or set a unified rules for rugby as well. The trouble with this plan was the fact that nearly 40 years since the inception of rugby, as it was known in 1823, had spread throughout the country of England, including to its many colonies. Only in roughly 1845, a slightly codified set of rules were created. This meant that teams across the globe, and England for that matter, had developed their own loose rules and traditions of gameplay. So there were different styles of gameplay. Rugby union rules, although adjusted from time to time, have predominantly remained the same since the game's formalization after the 1890s. Following the formulation of the rules, there were controversies surrounding amateurism versus professionalism, athletes playing rugby at the time. What's known as the Great Rugby Schism occurred in 1895, and this separated the once united rugby union into a rugby league and rugby union, which still actually both exist to today. The rugby union rules is what the United States adopted as their guide to play rugby and eventually what became football. Some of the positions had begun to change and name, but maintaining similar function. This game consisted of 2 teams of 15 players on each side, and these teams were divided into forwards and backs. Both groups had different styles of play. The forwards are typically the huskier players and predominantly play more with their feet and as they work the ball to get it out of the backfield. The backfield or backs typically pass more often, and they aim to beat the opposing team to the outside in order to score. Again, the 2 teams would face off. This time the players from the same side would hoist other teams, in which was known as a lift to get the ball from out of bounds. The main penalties that occur were offsides occurred when a man was ahead of a teammate who played. This is much like soccer is today. So I won't go into the rugby schism too much in this specific presentation, but I did want to talk about rugby in the West Coast of the United States. As I mentioned previously, with the controversial new rule changes that Roosevelt implemented, not everyone was sold. Many colleges recommended that their schools model their game play off English rugby rather than American football. Again, as I had just mentioned, that rugby at this time in the early 1900s had become much more of a sport rather than a loose gathering of men throwing the ball around and trying to tackle each other. The reasoning behind this was the English version was already well tested and well received. This was a bed of change, as many of the schools had used rugby rules of the late 19th century, so they weren't 100% sold on the new American rules. On the West Coast, an important decision made that would actually alter the course of football for quite a while. Following the rules of football release, the idea to play English rugby was decided by a joint athletic committee of the University of California at Berkeley and Stanford. In this meeting, in which both President Benjamin Ide Wheeler of the University of California at Berkeley and President David Starr Jordan of Stanford made their stand to play rugby, the two major colleges were fiercely opposed to switching to the new football rules. And in May of 1906, a conference was held between R.W. Barrett, the treasurer of the Stanford student body, and members of California's Intercollegiate Athletic Committee. At the committee meeting, they were unanimously declared that they would not accept the new football rules and in turn would play rugby. As English rugby seemed to be the game it was likely to play, the athletics community began to make plans to assist their programs. In order to grasp a better understanding of the game of rugby, the head football and baseball coach at Stanford, James F. Lanigan, departed to Canada to be trained by many of the enthusiasts of the game of rugby. Upon his return, he had positive reviews of the modeling of the school's gameplay. After the English rugby, he noted that one of the most distinct features of the gameplay was the absence of interference from the man with the ball, which made it necessary to have the ability to skillfully kick and pass the ball without error while in dead sprint. This was a positive push for rugby to continue, as well as many former football players had agreed they would come out and play the game if it was implemented in fall. Many supporters of both Stanford and Berkeley athletics were convinced by the key players' willingness to play rugby rather than football. The speculation of putting together a winning team was highly commented topic. The coach explained, "I feel confident that Stanford has the material for a winning team. We had a light and fast varsity last year, and it's just the kind of team that can play rugby." Shortly after, it was decided that by the Joint Committee that rugby would be the sport played in the fall. So, rise of the rugby in the West. These are just some newspaper clippings just highlighting the new rules, try to get fan engagement and people behind the sport. Despite the harsh split from football, some in the East warmed up to rugby. The New York Sun looked at it favorably and described it as a beautiful, speedy, and non-dangerous sport, offering plenty of excitement without the chance of serious injury, and giving the spectator, be an expert or a complete beginner, a far better chance to see what is coming off and getting their money's worth. The praise of rugby was surprised coming from an Eastern newspaper where they played exclusively American football. In addition to this paper, it also praised the rivalry that Stanford and UC Berkeley had developed with each other while playing rugby. Organized cheering, songs, and movements are kept up increasingly by the cheering sections of respective universities, and it is the feature as much as the game which attracts such an enormous gate or ticket sales to Stanford. One of the first major rugby-style contests between an American team and an international team took place in October of 1912 between the world champion Australia and Stanford University. Stanford University was able to defeat the Australians 13-12. This was the first time a rugby powerhouse team came to the United States to play a match against a collegiate team, as many newspapers described the event as the best rugby game ever played in Stanford. It appeared that rugby was here to stay. Not long after the Australian team finished their tour in the United States, plans were made for a strong English rugby team to tour the west coast of the United States. This tour was designed to incorporate a combination of Oxford and Cambridge players to showcase their talents in the United States. For this tour, the visiting British team would tour from Eastern Canada to the west and then eventually head southwards towards California. Eventually, the idea of creating an all-star team of Western rugby players came into play. Although this actual idea never materialized as planned, it did develop the desire for the United States and Canadian teams to play more international matches, which would help promote rugby and show their abilities to the rest of the world. In addition to a team from England to tour the area, the New Zealand All Blacks were set to be part of the tour of the West Coast in the fall of 1913. The All Blacks are one of the most powerful powerhouses in rugby still to this day, and they were always willing to accept new challenges. Throughout the month of October, New Zealand was set to play various colleges throughout California, including club teams. And upon accepting this invitation to tour the United States, the New Zealand rugby team began their selection processing to search out the best players they believed to make the journey. They began their selection by playing matches against the All-Australia team in order to determine the most qualified players. With only a month before the New Zealand rugby was set to visit the United States, they made additional requests for 2 more players added to their roster, increasing the traveling number from 21 to 23, a number that would stick to this day. Naturally, the California Rugby Union, who was hosting them, allowed them to bring the players under the condition that they would not be expected to held under one roof. The visiting Stanford UC Berkeley team, upon agreeing to these terms, the stage was set for a monumental series of games that would be deeply impact American rugby and American football. There was much anticipation for the New Zealand game that arrived in the United States. Newspapers documented nearly every step the New Zealand team took, even prior to arriving the shores of the coast. Upon their arrival, they were greeted by rugby union and city officials, describing as the greatest exponents of the game, the other side of the broad Pacific. Once the pleasantries were over, the New Zealand team began to do what they had set out to do, play rugby at an extremely high level. One of the first major games they played in the tour was against Stanford University. New Zealand dominated every aspect of the game, handling Stanford their worst loss ever with a final score of 54-0. The New Zealand team had demonstrated a mastery of the game and demonstrated the importance of running with the ball and having support to pass the ball off before or while the ball carrier was being tackled. This constant pace of the game wore down the defense of Stanford team, who despite their best efforts were outmatched. New Zealand's dominant play continued throughout their tour, regardless of who they were playing or their playing conditions. When playing St. Mary's on red adobe clay, the ill weather had made the field into a muddy mess. Despite this disadvantage for the All Blacks of New Zealand, they prevailed 26-0. In the midst of the New Zealand tour, Stanford and UC Berkeley were set to play their yearly, highly contested rugby match. Images of players that were set to complete line the sports sections all over major newspapers and report of 18,000 spectators who would be in attendance. Stanford ended up victorious following the classic matchup between the Stanford and UC Berkeley. The All Blacks are set to make their final appearance on tour. Naturally, the All Blacks heavily defeated the last team they played, leaving the United States with a remarkable record of 13 games played and 13 games won. And they defeated every United States team they played by huge margins. Following the New Zealand All Blacks tour, much was to be decided about the future of rugby in America. So naturally, now there was a decline of rugby. Following the humiliation handed down by New Zealand, controversy once again ensued. Many called for rugby to be abolished in the United States. The real question was, how much better was New Zealand compared to the Australian team that the United States had beat 13-12 in the year previous? Well, a month prior to traveling to the United States, New Zealand defeated that nearly same Australian team 30-5. In December of 1913, rugby football versus American football was set to take place. Using the 11 per side collegiate rules, the rugby players were defeated 24-2. As I mentioned, the scoring has changed throughout the years, so if that score looks a little different, that is why. This really became the turning point for rugby in the United States. Schools started thinking it might be a good idea to go back to football. The argument was made that since California had developed a team good enough to compete with first-class English teams, and clearly not the world-class New Zealand team, they were no longer competitive in American football. And at that time, right before that time, American football started to become a pastime. Eventually, the West Coast would end their play of rugby and really start switching more to American football. American football became really America's emerging pastime by the 1920s. It was clearly the most popular contact sport game, although a few teams in the West still held out and played rugby. Not only was college football being watched on the fields across the country, the next step in football was arriving in 1919. The first professional leagues were beginning to form and develop, organized schedule, and games. These were the building blocks which would propel American football into the 20th century and beyond. Professional football teams began to spring up throughout the Midwest and East. Even though the college game was being played in the West at this point, the lack of quality and rapid transportation was not there. Professional teams in the Midwest and East started to develop fierce professional rivalries that only built the excitement of football in America. So not only did you have it on the collegiate level, you had it on the professional level. Professional teams began to spread like wildfire, with teams opening and folding at a near constant rate. But it was still evident the idea of professional sports was here to stay. As baseball had done in the previous decades, football was becoming one of the nation's national pastimes. The United States had fully adopted the rules and regulations of American football, thus really making it a united American game. However, rugby did have a last attempt, and although the Olympics weren't as highly publicized or covered in the media as they are today, the game still represented a chance for countries to show their power globally in sports. The United States were willing to enter their name in any sport that had two countries, and were even willing to enter a second side necessary for any country's specific or favorite game, just to show that American dominance. The American Olympic Committee even decided not to enter the names in events such as diver walking events because they believed they would easily have won those contests without competition. According to G.T. Kirby, the president of the American Olympic Committee, our desire to enter teams in every event, though in many ways having a chance to win. It was just that chance to show their American athleticism. This set the scene for the United States to enter the name on the ballot to play rugby in the 1920 Olympics. Although teams no longer played rugby in the United States, it was not too hard to begin to look for rugby talent. The U.S. compiled a team that completed mostly of players out of the University of California at Berkeley and Stanford University. Shortly after the decision was made, the newly formed Olympic team went to the British Columbia and defeated 3 all-star rugby teams. Their games were played in Vancouver and Victoria, which were considered as the greatest rugby centers in Canada. Impressively, the United States were able to defeat France by a final score of 8-0. Following these Olympics, there was much debate on what games, if they would continue to play rugby in the 1924 Olympics in Paris, France. Initially, it was decided that rugby, along with tug-of-war, the 3,000-meter walk, grass, field hockey, archery, and golf would be removed from the Olympic program. However, this was short-lived and rugby was quickly reinstated within a month of its initial removal from the Olympic program. Eventually, program dates were set and rugby would be played May 3rd through May 18th in Paris, France. By the end of 1923, it was decided that the United States would once again enter a team in the Olympics for rugby. As the United States prepared to square up against teams in the Olympics, many thought that a slight revival of rugby was in the making. Nearly 4,000 fans witnessed a game in San Francisco that would help determine the final roster spots for the Olympic team. 3 teams would end up playing for supremacy in the rugby in the Olympics. As I mentioned before, not every team entered, and the Olympics weren't as highly publicized. These teams included France, the United States, and Romania. Since only 3 teams entered the field for rugby, each team would play each other once. Both the French and United States teams were expected to beat Romania, and their matchup on May 11th would be one of the final games. Prior to the arriving of the French soil, problems in the United States began to occur. The Olympic Committee was severely depleted of funds and had to work to raise nearly $350,000 required to send men and women to various sports to Paris. Once they were able to raise the funds, they were headed to Paris. Upon arriving, there was a disagreement about the U.S. taking their own photographs against Romania, which would be used for documentary and traveling and training purposes. The French Olympic Committee had maintained that their exclusive contracts for photographic work would be given to French firms throughout the Olympics. On top of this, the U.S. rugby team was also actually robbed of nearly 5,000 francs, several hundred dollars, watches, and other valuables. The stage was set for an epic Olympic rugby contest between the host country, France, and the defending Olympic champion, the United States. The United States played a hard-fought match against the French team, defeating them 17-3. Following the game, a fight broke out between the celebrating Americans and angry French fans. Mr. Nelson of DeKalb, Illinois, was struck in the head with a cane and was hospitalized from the melee on the field. This ensured the following the ending of the game, the media brought back reports of the United States portraying the French negatively. Following the bad blood that followed the game, many in the United States questioned why Americans even bothered with the game of rugby, as it only attracted 3 teams and failed as a sporting event. Following the United States' victory over France, the removal of rugby from the Olympic Games disappeared into the abyss. So I just wanted to give that brief little, extended background on the history of just American rugby and early American football, and really how it became a uniquely American sport. What I really wanted to get into now is the hidden history of women in college football and football in general. Women have been linked to college football from the beginning. Did you know that the women at Livingstone's Textile School stitched uniforms for both teams in the first historically black college and university football game between Biddle College, which is now Johnson C. Smith University, and Livingstone? This game happened on December 27th, 1892. Irma Bede is known as the Betsy Ross of football because she actually sewed the first penalty flags together in 1941. Interestingly enough, those are actually on display on the second floor of our Hall of Fame. Her husband, Dwight Dyke Bede, was the coach at Youngstown State in Ohio and had come up with the idea and used it on October 17th, 1941. The more obvious connection to football is the cheerleaders that pump up the fans on game day. Although I won't really go into that, that definitely is an integral role to what we know as the American football passion and the pageantry that we see today. Now, in the mid-20th century, several women's football leagues formed during the 20th century. One of these in the 1930s even became a national sensation, but they are barely remembered today by most. Although little is known about the short-lived women's football craze, some photographs do remain of players from Los Angeles. Life magazine in November 1939 And Click magazine in January 1940 covered these women in sports. Now, I just wanted to highlight, this is excerpt from Life magazine in 1939. And it's women playing football in Southern California. As you can see by these photos, tough black and white images of women dressed in full football uniforms, or at least full uniforms of that time period, including helmets, pants, and shoulder pads. And so I just have a few photos I wanted to share from these various games. So this is another spread from the 1939 Life magazine. These are the women just putting on their gear before a game. And you can see with this is definitely the real deal. Football, this is high contact, high collision, American football as we know it more, as we know it today. And I just really love this image again from Life, the 1939 magazine spread. And you can just see there's a cut above her face. She's smiling, having a good time, and really just loving the game of American football. Excuse me. Although these articles left barely any information on these pioneering players, other than assuring us they played hard, fast, regulation, tackle football. And this is from the now defunct Click magazine, which also highlighted the Professional Women's League. And again, you can just see these are very comparable to photos of male players during the same time period. So the next question, what happened? Who were these women and why did their football league disappear after only one season, especially as it was considered widely popular by many magazines? Despite Click's article assertion that they would expand nationwide, assertion that they would expand nationwide the following season. Many might assume that public disapproval was the cause. And this is a quote from Michael Oriad. He is one of the top historians on college football. There was an identification of football with masculinity, much like boxing or wrestling. For women to be playing it would have been seen as an extreme violation of the gender norms, as he said in his of the Los Angeles Players in 2004 in his book King Football. While that did ring true in much of the American sentiment of the time, there may be a different explanation for the league's demise, though this one had more to do with the women themselves, their own choice. The Life article talks about the Marshall Clampett Amazons. Much research on the subject was done by journalist Erica Wesley, a freelance journalist who primarily focuses on softball. The team was named after a car dealer sponsor. The Marshall Clampett football and softball teams ended up being related. The football team was the mainstay. The football players in Life article were members of the softball team first. The softball promoters had organized the football league as women's softball was extremely popular during the 1930s, especially in LA where women attended games, where women played the games. Even playing a charity softball game between the team and a men's squad, including silent film star Buster Keaton. The women's softball team beat the Palm Springs team 5-4. The football games appear to have been a way to capitalize on the popularity and extend ticket sales from the fall when the season ended to winter to expand the season. There was, of course, however, public backlash, as Newswire article reported in 1939 described them as an invasion of, as I quote, one of the last strongholds of masculinity. The Life article warned of the dangers of women from football. However, more than anything, it was likely the fact that it didn't make financial sense playing football, when the real opportunities for women in athletics at that point in time were in softball. Again, it was another way to divert interest, and even Spalding jumped into the mix. I really do love the Spalding media guides. They actually created an American football for women as, of course, a way to open up a new revenue stream, distributing a pamphlet, American Football for Women. In 1939, it was considered a safe game for all classes of women to play because there was no tackling or blocking or any other feature permitted that would be injurious to them. Essentially, it was two-hand touch. Despite this variation of football was about as innocent as a game of badminton, the editors of Youth Leaders Digest, an industry publication that courted executives from Parks departments, Boys and Girls Clubs, and the YMCA. Do you think a kick in the stomach or a blow to the chest, or maybe a short journey into the unconscious carries with any type of character building of our high school or collegiate girls? They asked, quoting the Life feature. It was just really went against the social norms of that time, and that was one of the ways that was just considered a little bit improper, if you will, for women to play tackle football. However, this time there was another resurgence in 1941, a second women's league. This time partial to Chicago. And again, these women came from softball backgrounds. The teams only played a few games and received only a little attention in local newspapers. With World War II on the horizon, little talk of women's leagues disappeared. Talk of women's league disappeared until the 1970s. As I mentioned, a semi-pro team emerged in the 1970s and received substantial media coverage with articles in magazines such as Texas Monthly, Ebony, and Jet. Again, failed to reach and maintain a wide audience and was forgotten. That brings us to the 21st century. New professional women's leagues have begun to emerge, which is tackle all-inclusive football. For example, legendary Cleveland Browns daughter, Kimberly Brown, actually plays professional women's football. But more began playing actually on the collegiate gridiron and, of course, officiated. And now I just wanted to talk about a few of these trailblazers. Liz Heaston of Willamette. She was a kicker in '97. She was actually the first woman to score in a collegiate football game, and she accomplished this with the NAIA Willamette on October 18th, 1997. Before college football, she actually played on the university women's soccer team. Next is Ashley Martin of Jacksonville State. She was also a kicker in 2001. You'll start to notice a kicking trend. And she became the first woman to play and score at the Division I AA or FCS, which is one division below the FBS or Division I level, on August 30th, 2001. Besides football, she also played on the Gamecocks soccer team. Katie Nita of Colorado and New Mexico. She was a kicker in 1999 and 2003. In 1999, she was the first woman to dress for a bowl game at the Inside Bowl. And in 2002, she transferred to New Mexico. On August 30th, 2003, she was the first to score in a Division I game. CALLIE Brownson of Dartmouth. She became the first full-time female NCAA Division I coach when she was named the offensive quality control coach at Dartmouth. She was actually hired as the chief of staff with the Cleveland Browns this year in 2020. And the last player I'm going to mention is Toni Harris. And this is a very interesting story. Rather than a kicker, which is typically the role previously women had played in collegiate football. She became the first female skill position player to sign a letter of intent on scholarship in college football history. She previously played at the legendary East Los Angeles College, which is one of the top junior colleges in the nation. And last, but certainly not least, Sarah Thomas. She began her officiating career in 1996 when she attended a meeting of the Gulf Coast Football Officials Association. She worked her first varsity high school game in 1999. In 2006, she was hired as member of the Conference USA staff. In 2007, she became the first woman to officiate a major college football game, working a game between Memphis and Jacksonville State. In 2009, she was selected to work the Little Caesars Pizza Bowl between Marshall and Ohio. In 2015, Thomas was hired as the first full-time female official in NFL history. During the 2018 NFL season, she was an NFL down judge. So now I want to take us, and I actually have the ability to showcase some of the items I'm talking about. Let me move us. As you can see, I'm actually in the College Football Hall of Fame archives right now. And I will just be going over a few interesting pieces that we have within our collection. Give me 1 second. As many of you at Lakeside, I'm sure are familiar with the white gloves. We always like to do that to protect the artifacts. So I want to first show this Liz Heaton jersey from Williamette. As you can see, this is definitely this is her game worn jersey. It was taken from after she broke ground and scored the first points. Just trying to figure out the camera here. Another interesting piece from her I want to show are her cleats. As you can see, these definitely were game used. Something I always love with artifacts is when the dirt's still on them. We make sure to clean them from any bugs, but we don't actually take or clean the items themselves to just make sure they don't destroy any of our other pieces of artifacts. The last person I want to highlight is Sarah Thomas. As I mentioned, she was the first full-time referee in the National Football League and at the collegiate level. We have one of her officiating hats. We have her penalty flag, yard marker, and of course, one of her referee uniforms. And although I can't put everything on display all the time, this definitely makes a heavy rotation as it's one of my favorite pieces to talk about. This is also one of her whistles from her career at the collegiate level. So now I want to turn it over to Dakota for any questions that the audience might have.
All right. Well, thank you, Jeremy. Hopefully you can hear me all again. Can all hear me again? We did have some questions come in while you were going through everything. One of them came in pretty early on, but I did think it was an interesting one. The deaths that you were talking about very early in the football and rugby transition that there were challenges with. We had 2 questions come in. Obviously, we didn't know much about concussion injuries back then, but were head injuries a primary point of concern in rugby and football injuries in the early 20th century?
Yes, I would say, especially with the way, especially the brutality of that game, it really was a free-for-all. Even the thing is, best way I describe it is, if you remember back in grade school when you're all running around tackling each other, and it's not really a game per se. Now amplify that by grown men doing the same exact thing, anywhere between 50 to 30 on a side. You can see, and especially, for example, with I think the best example is the Bloody Monday that was at the Harvard campus. That was really just a hill into a delta where they would run into each other, and it was really just a melee. And the big joke is that the ball was added later, so there wasn't even a point of contention. It was kind of one of those last man standing free-for-alls.
Free-for-all. Sounds like a lot of school games. So for the professional women's leagues that you did mention, did they play by the same rules as men did at the time? So I know
Yes,
you
they
kind
did.
of touched on them. Yeah.
Excuse me. Yes, they did. From what our research shows, that it was really just the same. It was the same game. Unfortunately, there was not a whole lot other than those articles and select newspapers that covered them in the area. But from what it seems and from the images, there's quite a few out there that it really was nearly identical game. And that, I think, really was some of the backlash is they saw women playing what they would consider a man's game at that point in time. And that's why Spalding introduced rules for women, which was really almost like a two-hand touch, a lot what they do now with powder puff football at the high school level. It's still a fun time. I mean, I know now they add flags and stuff like that, but it was really kind of the same balance to just get the spirit, get people excited.
Mm-hmm. And that's one thing too, I think would be important to mention that a lot of what you're talking about is the college football, but there are professional women's leagues that are still ongoing too. So this is an interesting archives museum question that I love, of course. When the Hall of Fame receives items like the game-worn cleats with dirt still on them and the jersey, are those donated by the individuals who wore them?
That's an excellent question. It is actually a wide range of both players, coaches. If once we start getting with some of the older Hall of Fame inductees or older players, a lot of times it's their family who passes them on. Maybe there wasn't as big of interest, but we also get a lot of research questions because the family knows, okay, dad had this helmet or dad had this or had that, but we don't really know much about it. I think we would like to donate it because we think more people can enjoy it, but at the same time, can you tell us what this is? So it's a really interesting mix of both players, coaches, and universities as well. So when major milestones are reached, I often end up reaching out to the school. So when a player sets a record, I might call them and be like, hey, would you guys be able to send us that jersey from that historic moment, especially as real milestones happen?
Mm-hmm. And I think it's just kind of a funny story. When Jeremy and I worked together, we were at the Pro Football Hall of Fame. We experienced that one time when Khalil Mack was setting a lot of records, and we had an entire bag of all of his gear sent to us. Fortunately, some of it was not worn because we would get jerseys that were worn, and those were not too much fun to open up in shipping containers. It didn't smell very good in the rooms when we were working on those. So here's another good question. Do you foresee more women taking active roles within football moving forward as far as refereeing, coaching, executives, etc.?
Oh, absolutely. And we can even tell this with women in sports, maybe not just even on the field, but in the industry as well. Our new CEO, Kimberly Bowden, she's just one of the leaders in the sports industry. And just really, I see that opening up for more women having the opportunity to take an active role, both on the executive side, but also in the field side. You see more and more women playing, but also refereeing, coaching. I think basketball is doing one of the best movements. You can just, they're definitely cultural trendsetters in the pro sports atmosphere more than some other sports. And I think that definitely helps push sports along further because in theory you can kind of test it out on the NBA, and of course it works because women absolutely have the same capabilities and abilities as men, and I think that's showcased in the NBA, and so then other sports I think are more and more willing to move to that next level, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, that's good news for everyone else, I think. This is one question that I was actually going to ask too. So one of our viewers is an avid football fan, and they want to know what your favorite artifact in the collection is.
Yeah, absolutely. Interestingly enough, I have it. Give me 1 second.
Maybe knew this question was coming, huh?
It's fun because it's going on display next. So, let me move some room. I want to talk about this. What we have is a Warrior helmet given to head coach Eddie Robinson in 1976 in the Pioneer Bowl. It was the first game played outside the Western Hemisphere, where he took Grambling State, which is his team. They played Morgan State in what was known as the Pioneer Bowl. He was one of the pioneering players at the historically black college and university level. Interestingly enough, his grandson actually works here, and we always love talking about Eddie Robinson's legacy. But I mean, it's just a really cool helmet. Has a lot of interesting history. The family jokes that before this was a donation from the family. This was actually in their parlor room as kind of on display. And the person who donated always joked that was part of their job on Saturdays, is make sure you dust Granddad's helmet. And I do have another piece I'd like to highlight.
Those that are watching, we're hoping one day the Lakeside Heritage Society archives will look as organized as Jeremy's archives are there.
So is there any guess on who this might be? For those of you not sure, this is Mr. Otto Graham's Collegiate All-American jersey.
Woo!
And one of my favorite pieces of this, and let's see, give me 1 second. Luckily, everything's right nearby. One of my favorite things to do is be able to match a jersey with the player actually wearing that specific jersey. And as you can see, this was one of the Collegiate All-American games that Mr. Graham played in. And as you can see, it matches very well with the uniform. You can see the cuts and tears from his time playing. And one thing a lot of people don't know, a lot of these early jerseys were basically onesies, as they were a way to keep up and keep everything together. But these are probably two of my favorite artifacts that we have. And as I mentioned, they were actually on display because the beauty of being the historian and curator here, I can kind of showcase things I really do find interesting as well. And the last thing I want to show, one of my favorite books. It's Black College Football, and it really gives a great in-depth story of some of the pioneers of both historically black colleges and universities, but also those that broke the color barrier in American football. So are there any other questions that you or the audience have?
We did have one question come in, so this will probably be our last one, and it popped up while you were bringing out the jersey. So when caring for fabric items like jerseys and cleats, how does that differ from caring from other items like trophies?
Yeah, absolutely. We have to definitely be a lot more careful depending on the age of the artifact. For example, I was just handling Red Grange's jersey from the early 1920s. With that jersey being 95 years old, there has to be a lot more care taken to it. We actually sew the item, we sew the accession numbers into the artifacts to just make sure they stay safe and we can access them. The biggest thing is we're trying not to damage the artifacts in any way. With trophies, it's a little more, they're usually a little more durable, where we have our own archival techniques that make sure we can write and declare what the artifact is without actually damaging the physical artifact.
Right. Well, thank you, Jeremy, for all of your information today. You have such a background in everything that you're doing, and I know that you could go on and on with and football and all the artifacts and museum studies. So I would recommend if anyone's in the Atlanta area to check out the College Football Hall of Fame the next time you're in town. I know that Jeremy's putting up a new exhibit here now on HBCUs that will be up until, when did you say, Jeremy?
It'll be up until early November, so there's plenty of time to get out there and open. We'll be reopening July 1st.
July 1st. So as long as everyone can stay safe and healthy, we'll be hoping that some people will be able to check out that exhibit. But thank you again for joining us today. And thank you everyone who watched and will be watching later. We appreciate your time. We will be sending out a survey to everyone who participated. You'll receive that within the next day or two to help us get a review of all the programs that we're offering, and also your time when you watched it on Zoom. We're trying to make it as easy as possible for everyone. And be sure to stop back tomorrow. Tomorrow's going to be a little bit different setup. I will actually be doing an introduction to two exhibits that I really enjoy, including one that is in France. And they're both Olympic Museum exhibits, and they talk about women's experience as Olympians, including some of the earliest Olympians like Charlotte Cooper. And then for all of those who are interested, next week's Chautauqua lecture series will actually be a workshop format. Mika Mendenhall from the Women Writing for a Change group out of Cincinnati will be leading a guided workshop for all of those who are interested. Please contact us at either dharkins@lakesidehiohio.com or edintern@lakesidehiohio.com to sign up for those. And with that, we are sending all our love from Lakeside, and we hope you have a great rest of your day.
Take care, everyone.